when I was asked to give this talk, I was a bit apprehensive. After all, you are a pretty knowledgeable bunch of people. And I've got a story to tell. So have you. You've got a lot of stories. And I suppose one of the things I've got to say right off the reel, it's a bit of a confession. When you think of World War II blokes, you think of Spitfires, Lancasters and heroes. Well, the confession is, I'm no bloody hero. I certainly would have liked to have been a hero. I dreamed of being a, well, Spitfire Ace or Lancaster bomber or something. But the fact of the matter is, I never had an opportunity, and I didn't want to be a VC when a post-human VC was not for me, but I'd like to run a DFC. As it turned out, I didn't really have the opportunity. In fact, I suppose the confession is, I'm a bit like Mr. Offenbach's John Dahms. You know the song? Anyway, what it amounts to is, when danger looms, we're never there. So that's the story of my flying. But I suppose if in this talk I can convey some of the fun, pleasure and the interest I've had in flying, both during the war and since, well, talk will be worthwhile. I'm going to go right back to when I started flying. It goes back to 1936. I had a flight in Captain Sook's Spartan. If you read Brian's book, Forgotten Flyer, it's mentioned in that. It really was a B-grade aircraft, I think even in those days, but it flew, and the chap that took me up was a chap called Bob Hickson. And he was a very interesting character too. Anyway, followed that up a year or two later by flying a Tiger one. And that was sheer pleasure. Coming back from rock desk, I think what had happened, a couple of blokes and I had organised, well, the other chap had organised a pilot he knew to fly the aircraft over, and we paid the fare back. It's a good way of getting a bit of free flying, but it was very good. It was well worth it, the trip over the Zephyr and the trip back. Anyway, that was our first introduction to flying. Then I tried to join the Air Force, first of all as a fitter, and I didn't have skills for that. I went to night school and made a little bit of progress. In the meantime, I had a stint in the Army, but in the meantime, the RAAF and their wisdom had lowered the standards, and the Empire Training Scheme was introduced, as mentioned by Stan. And I managed to convince the authorities, the enlisting people, that I could learn enough to be eventually called up, which I was in 1941, in May 41. I flew for 5 years with the Air Force until 1946. And as I say, it wasn't particularly dangerous. It was sheer enjoyment as far as I was concerned. But even so, I had other things in mind. I wanted to be a farmer, I wanted to get married and all those things. So I didn't touch flying again for 13 years. And then a gentleman called Bill Bolden, these names might ring a bell to you, but he had got onto a whacker trainer. I'd flown whackers incidentally, and I didn't like them much, but he'd got onto a whacker trainer and converted to a crop sprayer. It wasn't a bad crop sprayer. It had a seat in the back, so he said, would you like to go on one of these crop dusting runs and sit in the back? Well, it was a bit hair-raising, but going back to service days, I loved low flying, and that was low flying, pretty good low flying. Anyway, I was hooked again. I said, well, next thing I'm going to do is go down to the Aero Club and join up. Anyway, I did. I took out a pilot's license in 1960. I've kept it since, and took up gliding in 1978. I never regretted that either. But incidentally, I keep my flying up to date by doing the regular BFRs, and I'd like to comment on this particular one too. They've always been, piece of cake if you like. The last one, I wanted to do it in a diamond. I tried to do them in different aircraft, just as a matter of interest. Anyway, this one in the diamond, it was a bit hard. The aircraft was unserviceable, or the weather wasn't right, or it wasn't programmed. I got the message after a while, they didn't really want to fly. It wasn't very good bet, I suppose. Anyway, not long after that, I was looking after my wife at Mandurah. She just had a knee replacement. I was the carer. And anyway, I left her to have a sleep or something one day and went out to the Aero Club, and there was a delightful young bloke called Mark Ulonska. You people know him in the Aero Club. He said, I know it's no trouble. Here, there's some left questions to answer. You answer those and I'll take you flying. Just as simple as that. I didn't get all the answers right, but by the time he checked them all, they were all right. You know the story. Anyway, 40 minutes of flight, 48 I think it was. I convinced him that I could fly a 172, a 152 rather. So I'm current. Gliding is, I'm current in that too. As a matter of fact, I'll mention that later in the talk about a flight I did quite recently. Anyway, that's enough background. But I call this talk The Mighty Answer. That's the answer. Well, the story with the answer was, it was a lovely aircraft, it was docile, and was very, very reliable, but it wasn't a particularly good trainer because it was just too damn easy. After the Tiger Moth, it was very easy, but it was a good trainer, and not only did you learn to fly, but you learned to shoot guns and drop bombs and all that sort of thing. So it was a good trainer, but it had a couple of things wrong with it. It had never been spin checked, and no-nos were a complete, aerobatics were a complete no-no. I loved aerobatics. At Cundon, I used to do them whenever I could. Bob Giles, my instructor, used to encourage, yes, go up and try some aerobatics, Dick. If you want to do it, you go and do them. Anyway, I loved them, but anyway, one time flying this stupid Anson, I thought, a little wing over, that's not really a violent manoeuvre. I can do a wing over. The fact of the matter was pointing about that angle, not really steep. I was pulling like hell to get it out. It came out. There was a bit of a crack at one stage. Anyway, I got it down, and one of the ground blokes, as he waved me, says, "Who you been bombing, mate?" "I've been bombing anything." "Well, the bomb doors are open," he said. Anyway, I think there was a golden ruling amongst those ground crew was they were great blokes. They didn't put the pot on their trainees. Stupid things like that, so I got away with it. But it did have its repercussions in as much as the Aggie had another fault. It didn't fly very well on one engine. As a matter of fact, with one engine, it was just a protracted glide. Anyway, for all the reliability, I knew of one engine failure in the Waggy, and I had it. We were actually at that stage in the second half of our training, and we flew with our aircrew. One bloke flew and the other did the navigation, and somebody did the photography and that sort of thing. Well, we accumulated about twice as many hours that way as we would normally. But this time it was a photographic exercise with a chap called Frank Smallhorn. His nickname was Whopper. But he was also a very good pilot too, and he had a few more brains than I did, fortunately. Anyway, we had a complete engine failure at about 1,000 feet above the ground at Witcherina Dam. Anybody know Geraldton? Witcherina Dam is about 30 miles inland, perhaps not that. But it's far enough inland so you can't actually see it. Well, we were at that level, we couldn't see the airfield. Anyway, what it amounts to is we got this stupid answer flying on one engine, okay? And I didn't have to put it through the gate, it was coming down. But it was a bit of a cliffhanger until we actually eyeballed the airfield. And then it was, I thought, oh gee, I'd better do the right thing and do a circle. I said to Mr. Frank, he said, "You don't be a bloody idiot, we're going straight in." Well, it was the right thing to do. But the duty pilot, air-traffic control, duty pilot, we called it, wasn't so sure. He saw this aircraft steaming straight in, so he pointed a blinding red light at me. Then he started firing various missiles from his gun. But anyway, we landed successfully, left the aircraft right where it was. And I never told on the aircrew, on the ground crew, why that engine stopped. I still don't know why. It certainly wasn't finger trouble. Anyway, that was the Anson. And I suppose the point of this tale "What did you do in the war, Daddy?" "I flew the mighty Anson out of Geraldton." And to tell you the truth, that was just about as much hazard in that flying as I was ever exposed to. I did actually do a little bit of flying in a Liberator, like about 400 hours incidentally. But the only actually operational flying was at the OTU, and that was in New Guinea. It was a place called HBRTU, Heavy Bomber Replacements Unit, and run by the Americans. And much as Stan said, sometimes the lectures weren't that good and all a bit haphazard, but the flying was good, and the bombing ranges were places like Wewak and Rabaul, where we could be shot at. So I wear the RSL badge with pride. And each year I front up and say the right things. But that was the extent of my operational training. So I suppose what I talk about is what happened after Geraldton. Well, I passed out of there with the rank of sergeant, and it was very fortunate. I was training at that stage too, because the war in Europe was pretty damn hectic, and they were losing a lot of aircraft, and the Lancaster boys were screaming out like hell, "Come on, we want a few more pilots." So the Empire training scheme was feeding the pilots in. But when the Japanese came in the war, Mr. Curtin and his mates, "Oh, we can't send the troops overseas, we want them here." Well, fair enough. The trouble was we didn't have any aeroplanes to fly here. Australia didn't have many aeroplanes at all. Had a couple of squadrons. And incidentally, they very soon shot out of the air when the Japanese came in. So anyway, what amounts to is our course weren't sent overseas. And I probably might have got onto fighters too, incidentally, because I've been recommended to go onto fighters. This stupid aerobatics business. Anyway, what it amounted to is, I think the authorities, and particularly the people that organised the postings, didn't quite know where to send us. So I got sent to a place called 2AD, Richmond, 2 Aircraft Depot. Nobody had even heard of that at Geraldton. I said, "Well, what's that all about?" And somebody said, "Oh, I think they have something to do with repairing aeroplanes. You sure get the experience and a nice lot of types of aircraft." "Oh, that's all right." Well, I got to 2AD, and the only aircraft to fly were these bloody Tiger Moths. Where is that? So there's a Tiger Moth one. Yeah, there we are. Well, I love Tiger Moths. As I said, I did aerobatics night. But when I was faced with having to fly them for about 3 months, which we did, I got a bit jack off to these things. So I did a bit of low flying. And it would have been quite all right flying these things if only I'd been involved. But at one stage, I did this stupid damn thing. I touched the wheels along the beach at Coolangatta. It was beautiful. Well, that was stupid enough, but the most stupid thing was to skite about it. But what did happen on one of these stupid ferry flights, and that's virtually what we're doing at 2AD, they're making the Tiger Moths in thousands. We were ferrying them out to various units, and this particular one happened to be up to Toowoomba. I'm not too sure why they needed a Toowoomba, but anyway, that's where I was going. And that particular incident, but just previous to that, there's another stupid thing happened, and it's before I did that, running the wheels along, and it was all a bit stupid really, but there were 6 of us engaged in a ferry flight to take Tiger Moths from Richmond to Cootamundra, and at Goulburn we were refueled there, and the refueler happened to be a chap that could actually start engines, and also he was the mayor of the town. And at that particular stage they were running a chain of pennies or something in the war effort, and we were asked if we could drop our pennies in a different line along the main street, and a little bit of boost so people would come and give money. Well, that was all very fine, but we weren't authorised to do that. You're not allowed to fly over cities now at 500 feet to drop pennies. Anyway, it was saying we were in a place. All would have went well, but one of the chaps happened to do a bit of damage in his mates. He pulled a wire down, and the wire had a wall attached to it, and there was a woman under the wall. And consequently, we weren't too happy about it. We went on our way rejoicing. Then this business of running the wheels on. Then there was another flight from Cootamundra. We picked up the aircraft and we had to take them to Narromine. And one of the blokes must have thought, if bloody Sasse can run the wheels along the road, so can I. Sure enough he did, but he picked a newly seeded paddock. The wheat was up, so it looked a bit green from low level, but in actual fact it was muddy, and what happened, of course, he finished upside down. Well, it wasn't really funny at the time. There's 5 other blokes in the flight. One chap went around very quickly, must land, must land. The other 3 disappeared, they didn't see it. And he landed so quickly, he also bragged. So he two tiger moths. And I'm afraid I'm not quite as stupid as that. I went around and did the circuit and picked a nice landing spot and landed. And okay, you blokes are right. I can quite remember the poor muddy bloke that actually tipped the aircraft over the other fellow with the wrecked wheels and struts and things. He wasn't for talking about. His very words was, "You bastard, Sasse." So I knew what he meant. Anyway, the upshot of that lot, those 2 lots, they caught up with me. I was court-martialed twice. And for the second fence, which was the one with the wheels dragged on the road, I was reprimanded. And the chief of the court, I think his name was Group Captain, well, I've got his name now, said as I was going out, he says, "Bloody good show you could do, get away with that though." Something like that. So that wasn't too bad. But the first offence, when we'd actually flown over the city, I got 12, no, it wasn't 12 months, 8 months in jail over that, and to be ranked back to LAC. So it wasn't that bad. The month in the guardhouse was quite interesting, as much as we'd given jobs like cleaning the toilets, which wasn't that bad really. After all, there was about half a dozen other detainees. The other job was chopping the wood for the nurses, and for some reason or other, nobody seemed to be able to chop wood but me. No, I could chop wood. Consequently, I got the cup of tea. And also, because I told the guards I had to keep my flying current, they were taking me up each day to session in the link trainer, which, well, link trainer was a B-grade thing anyway, to sit in an early, if you don't know what it is, an early simulator. Just training instrument flying. So anyway, what matter, as soon as I got out of jail, I got back into Tiger Moths, and it was rather the turning point, because by that stage Richmond was getting a bit busy. There were Beauforts and Beaufighters and Hudsons and goodness knows what there. And although I didn't fly those for quite a while, at least I had a ride in them and I got familiar with the aircraft. And if you blokes, and you probably know as well as I do, if you want to fly an aircraft and bird with, go for a ride in it, see what it does, hear what it feels like. And if you've got the opportunity, taxi it around the field, all these things. And then test and ferry, which this unit finished up as test and ferry, that's basically what we did. Anyway, I think, I'll see if I can find the aircraft, rather turn things around. That was the Moth mine, that was a lovely little aircraft to fly, and I did fly there once in a while. There's the Dragon. You people know dragons, no doubt?
Indeed.
I had 1 or 2 interesting flights in that. They had an interesting characteristic that they had very good lifting capacity, but they had a habit, particularly if you had a bit of weight in the tail, you could lift the tail off in the initial stage of the takeoff, but if you were too vicious about it, you'd get it up level, then install the tail bloody up, whack down. It was quite definite. Apart from that, they flew pretty well, and I won't talk about the episodes of that because they're a bit mundane, but I'll go on to the next one. The Rapide. I only did 2 flights in that. I'd comment on it really. It was at Test and Ferry, it was our job to go to Mascot from there, from Richmond to Mascot, and go through these various aircraft and these testing by the various private contractors. And I hadn't flown the Rapide before, but the book was there, and I read it and read the instructions. And it was a bit like a Dragon, except it was twice as nice. It was a beautiful aircraft to fly. If anybody's ever flown a Repeat, you'll agree with me. They're a smooth and lovely thing. So I only had the 2 flights in that. One was to test it, and the next was to actually ferry it up to Keilor. That's the Dragonfly. Well, I shouldn't be showing this, because that's the only aircraft I ever damaged through sheer lack of skill. And I'd say that quite, I'm skiting a little bit. But during my service days, I didn't damage an aircraft. That one had one particular characteristic. Empty, it was quite docile, but fully loaded, you couldn't take off unless you had a little bit of differential braking. I hadn't read the good book enough to know that. Opened the throttle with full load and away it went grounded quite nastily. So I wasn't particularly popular over that, but once again my allies, the ground crew, hushed it up. Oh, it was just one of these things that happened. So no more said, but I've told you now, I've admitted it after all these years. I pranged the bloody thing. Now that's the Wirraway. Stan talked about the Texan and the harbour. The only difference with the Wirraway, I believe, was the damn sight hard to fly. Anyway, it wasn't an easy aircraft to fly, so he also was a damn good trainer. The score was, the others trained on Answers, or we trained on Wirraways, and the boys that trained on Wirraways never had any trouble flying Answers. But put an Answer pilot in the Wirraway and it was a different story. Anyway, I managed to get a conversion on that, and I was cheeky enough. Well, I had heard that I was supposed to train gone up to fighters at one stage, but I lost track of that flying these stupid Tiger Moths for about 4 or 5 months without anything else. But I managed to dig up the signal, convert Sasse onto Wirraways, and the only bloke that, in the whole of Richmond, there were about 2,000 people at that station, I think, was the commanding officer, a chap called Paddy Heffernan. You've probably heard of him. He was a group captain, and of course a group captain from a silent is a big step. You very much yes sir, no sir. But I went in as large as life, knocked his door, come in, Tony. Sir, would you like to give me a conversion onto Wirraways? Like nothing better, laddie, let's go and do it. Anyway, 2 or 3 hours later, I'd mastered the Wirraway. I never had any trouble with it. It was pretty good, and I really loved them. They were nice aircraft to fly, but they weren't easy. If you held them off too hard and pulled the stick too back, they would give a wing. Of course, that didn't do much good to the aircraft either. They were a delight to hear about, and generally speaking, they treated me well, but I had actually 3 episodes with that. One, there again, it hang my head in shame, but once again I was doing aerobatics on what should have been a routine test flight. And one of the things with these test flights, they were only after routine repairs, but the deal was the ground, so well, you sign the book, you go on the test flight. I think they do the same thing now very often. Anyway, what amounts to, I had this chap as a passenger, and there again, once again, doing aerobatics. Well, whether it was finger trouble, I don't think so. I never admitted it anyway. But halfway through a slow roll, just when I pushed the stick forward, my lap belt let go. Well, because they're constant speed air screw, hang on to tightly with one hand, use the other hand. So I had a pretty good grip, both on the stick and both on the side longeron. Consequently, when I tumbled out halfway out, the first thing was pull back on the stick, and it didn't fit very neatly, half rolled out, back on the seat, no trouble. Closed the canopy, went on my way rejoicing, but it didn't do my reputation around the traps very much good. Don't fly with that stupid bloody Sasse, you'll jump out and leave me with it. And the other episode, which was a bit alarming, for some reason it did happen from time to time. The main engine fuel pump didn't work. There was always a pretty good let out. They had a wobble pump at the side, a priming pump, and provided you pumped hard enough, you could keep the thing going. Anyway, on a ferry flight between Canberra, and Forest Hill, well, that stage. About halfway over the Tiger Country engine cut out. So there I was for the next half or 3/4 hour. Anyway, I got it back okay. And then, lo and behold, of course, the circuit area picked up and landed normally. What did you do that for? I don't know. Try and find out what's wrong with it. The other episode was a little bit more critical. I talked about Valley Vengeance in one of the, I wrote an article in Flight Path. Brian knows about that. But the Valley Vengeance pilots didn't have enough Valley Vengeance to go around, so they converted some of the Wirraways into dive bombers. They put just that dive brakes, top of the wings. There was a bit of a temporary arrangement, and to do that, they actually cut away part of the trailing edge. So the trailing edge boilers, trailing edge flaps. And then I did several flights and no trouble at all. It worked well. And this particular one was only a travel flight, but this was one of the aircraft that did. And the final leg, I think I went from Richmond to Bankstown, Mascot, another one, Penrith. Yeah, Camp, rather. The very last landing, just coming in, landing, doing the wrong thing, coming in, curved approach, the inside flap didn't go down, just like that. Fortunately, and of course the spoiler was still up, it was a bit dicey, therefore it just went into a very, very nasty roll. But because it had that thing coming up, I realised straight away, while my hand was still on the flap lever, that the flap wasn't going down, so just put it up. Well, I walked away from it, but it was a bit close to go. So that was one of the episodes of Testing Ferry. There were various other things came along. Ferry Battle, that was a nice aircraft to fly. It was designed as a dive bomber. There was an episode in England, I think 10 people went out to bomb a bridge. They bombed a bridge and they gave a posthumous DC, VC to the lead of the flight. Nobody got back. So the ferry battle was phased out. They didn't think there was much of an aircraft for that. So they packed some of them up to Australia for drogue towing, any stooge work like that. We never did any training on, but I just happened to fly once or twice. I did a ferry flight incidentally, which was quite enjoyable. There was only one problem, that on takeoff at Bankstown, the maps were out the window, and the flight was from Bankstown to East Sale, I think it was. Anyway, I flew the whole trip, just keeping Australia on my right and hoping somewhere along my line see the right aerodrome to land at, which I did incidentally. Stupid damn thing to do after all, the weather could have closed in, anything was wrong, but anyway, I got away with that. That was the ferry battle. Hawker Demon. I only did 2 flights in that too. One was the same thing, it had been repaired, and I had the honour of getting it to see if it could fly again. It was a beautiful thing to do aerobatics incidentally. To climb like a rocket and all, you know, it was a beautiful thing. Anyway, I think what I meant to do is I took it back to Bankstown and the various spots. It wasn't Hawker Demon, let's fly that thing. Of course, somewhere along the line, before it could be ferried where it was supposed to be, somebody pranked it. I didn't get my backside into it again for about another month, but I eventually got my backside in and took it out to sail, I think, again. So that was my experience with the Hawker Demon. But they were made in about 1926 or 28. I think they were A1. That's not but I think they had a registration A1. Hawker Demon. Oh, what was it? That's not a very good one of the Beaufort, but that is the Beaufort. The Beaufort. Is Charles Page here today, by any chance? Charles Page wrote the book Vengeance in the Outback, Vengeance of the Outback, which I talked about. He also wrote the book
Wings of Destiny.
Wings of Destiny. He talked about the Beaufort and its bad habit of nose diving when least expected. my experience with Beauforts, and actually I did most of all Liberates, then Answers, then Beauforts, and that order, and the amount of flying I did. I did quite a bit of flying with Beauforts. They made them at Mascot at that particular stage, and our job in Test and Ferry was test them. Acceptance test, the firm test pilot did that, a chap called Young. Remember anybody's name? Tommy Young. And as a bit of story of that too, he was a bit out of patience with these Air Force sprogs, and we were only sprog pilots by comparison, like 200 or 300 or 400 hours at that particular stage. Tommy had tens of thousands of hours, and we would find fault with his Beauforts, and he said, "Oh God, finger trouble, you don't know anything about Beauforts." And Mr. Page does point out very well, there was something very radically wrong with them. The authorities just wouldn't listen to them until lots of blokes had been killed in the damn thing. It was a question of what they called the breeze unit, which just purely was a little adjusting device to adjust the trim tab at the back to get it properly in balance. It had a bad fault in as much as it had an aluminium pin holding the nut. After a while, the nut would vibrate like that, the aluminium would shear, and the nut, because it was actually turning that way, every time a bit of vibration would go further and further back. So the first indication that things were wrong was the thing would flutter a bit, and finally the nut would drop off altogether. And the Australian Beaufort had one big design fault, because they couldn't get the right engines for it. Bristol Taurus would not turn up. Yeah, it would. Anyway, what it means, they couldn't get the right engines here. They put the Pratt & Whitney, the 1250 horsepower, which should have given them better performance. But in actual fact, all it made them very nose heavy, because they gobbled up so much more fuel. They had to have bigger tanks. Consequently, they didn't do much good. But they were inherently nose heavy, because counteracted by the trim tab. If the trim mechanism failed, this is the inevitable result. And quite a few people were lost in that. Before they woke up, it was wrong, and that was probably was addressed by putting a steel pin through instead of an aluminium one. Just as simple as that. If they put a steel pin in the first place, it would have saved, well, I think it was hundreds of lives. They were very dangerous. Anyway, they treated me okay. I loved them. I could skydive, I did aerobatics, and to tell you the truth, I rolled one once, and it was quite a nice effort. But the point is, there was always a problem with aerobatics with that thing. There's a LLL, is it? AAA? LLL, loose articles. There was lots of loose articles, other people in books and God knows what. So you couldn't possibly do aerobatics or something to negative G's. But I did do a barrel rolling one time, and it was good too. The other bit of drama I had was probably finger trouble, although it may not have been. On takeoff, open the throttle wide, as you normally do with the right hand. Hang on the stick, through nicely airborne, lift the undercarriage up, routine procedure. One throttle come back like that. Once again. Anyway, I'm here to live to tell the tale of where we were quick enough to what did happen. Left the undercarriage dangling while I put the throttle back where they should be. The other thing, I landed one without brakes. It blew out in the air, and that was a bit of trauma too. I landed at Ceduna, and well, it was big enough. And Ceduna is a notoriously windy place. But fortunately, I had as passenger a ground crew bloke. It was quite clued up. He said, "Oh, I fixed that." And half an hour later, he found we had blown off, and we went on our way rejoicing. What else about Beauforts? That was about it. My job with them was actually mostly what they call operational testing. When they were accepted and brought back to Richmond, they put the guns in them, and put the oxygen in, put the radios in, and just flew them while the various pods and checked those things. Firing the guns was good fun. We went out, used to go out off the heads in Sydney and firing the white caps. Anyway, that was Beauforts. But I will mention too that they were a major breakthrough. I managed to get conversion onto those, and I think I did 6 hours over a weekend. It was quite intense. And one of the pilots' name was Dave Cahoon. I've never worked out whether he was Frank Cahoon's brother, not. It was the most intense, most enjoyable bit of flying I ever did. And I reckon I learned more than those 6 hours there. And I learned in a lot of flying. But the Beaufort was a handful. It really was. You would swing at it, and it would bounce like heck. It was quite a handful. And also, of course, I gloried in my low flying skills. Was one of the items on the curriculum was the low level circuit, 50 feet. 50 feet, and that sort of aircraft was not exactly. Let's see what else was it. That's the Beaufort, of course. I'm quite unashamed of it. That was my favourite aircraft. Partly because it was such a capricious beast. You can see the size of those engines. You can see where the pilot sits. What amounts to is there was no horizon in the front for a start. So taking them off, you never knew quite where you were. The only way you really tell was if you were sitting reasonably comfortably, not like that, you see that would be about right. The other thing, they had so much power that if you got it wrong, they'd get off the ground about 70 knots or something like that. But the stalling speed was about 85, so that was being fairly critical. So the drill of the Beaufort was to hold them down to that plenty of speed. They were very manoeuvrable for a big aircraft. If anybody had flown them, quite surprising. You could whiz them around. Yes, I really liked the Beaufort. There again, I probably had as much trouble with those as any. One episode, I lost oil pressure, and I wasn't sure whether it was engine trouble or not. But when the pressure goes off, oil pressure goes into, I thought better do something about this. So I had the pleasure of dumping out. Well, these days it would be tens of thousands of dollars worth of fuel, but quite a lot of fuel, and then landing at the nearest airfield, which is this gold one, this place that had caused me so much trauma before with these damn Tiger Moths. Well, it was only a comparatively small field, so putting it down on one engine and this small field was an experience anyway. But having satisfied that it was all right, I rang up the boss and said, well, can you get somebody to just check and see what is wrong with it? Anyway, we couldn't get another gauge. But there again, I had a ground crew bloke with me. He says, it's probably only the gauge, mate. We'll give it a go. So just what he did. He started the engine up and had his finger hard over the line, and took his finger off and oil squirted everywhere. He's right, mate. It'll fly right. So I took it back without the oil pressure gauge. Anyway, and the other thing is one time at Forest Hill, I had that was a bit more traumatic too. They're very critical about the oil quantity and quality of the Beaufort. And as a matter of fact, I've read a book quite recently by a chap called, look, the name forget, but Beaufort's in the Pacific. It's a good one anyway. And it does mention the fact that if you get the grade of oil wrong, you get it wrong, you can cause foaming. And that's exactly what happened with this aircraft. And it ran a big end on takeoff, incidentally, or first climb. We never heard such a racket noise like bang, 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 bang. But it was delivering power, so I just put up with the bang and brought it back, but it could have been worse. Anyway, that's Beaufort. Let's see, what else?
Yeah, I wonder we won the war.
And
No wonder we won the war.
you'd wonder how we won the war. That's the Hudson. I just got my backside into Hudson about 4 or 5 hours. I can't say any more, but the Hudson, they treated me well. They were quite a delight to fly, and they were surprisingly good aircraft. They were quite slippery, quite good. They didn't behave very well in the stall situation. There was one bad accident where I think Fairbridge was it? Anyway, the Minister of Aviation was killed at Canberra. One stall. But no, they were nice. They really were. That's the Ventura. That was the big brother of the Hudson. I had a bit more to do with that. In fact, I had quite an interesting bingle with it. Well, before I did, incidentally, at Richmond, it was a very big base, and there were people coming and going all the time. There was a parachute unit, for one thing. The Americans used to come in and pick up aircraft, particularly P-40s, whatever happened to be flying there, what happened to be assembled. And Test and Ferry, we were there to do any particular job, and once or twice, or it was a bit more than that, perhaps half a dozen times, I got the job of fighter affiliation, you called it. And generally it was a Beaufort. Take a Beaufort up and let the P-40s, Yankee P-40s have a go at you, see how good they were. And anyway, I did the same thing with this Ventura one time. And they were surprisingly manoeuvrable, they really were. And, matter of fact, when I came down, one of the Yankee pilots was gracious enough, he says, "Those babies, they sure can turn around." So that was a Ventura. And the other thing I had with it, they had 2,000 horsepower engines, which gobbled a hell of a lot of fuel. So they really went a success. So by the time they put the extra fuel tanks in, long-range tanks, wing-tip tanks, and they couldn't carry much bomb load, so they weren't very effective as a bomber. But also, the fuel system to transfer the fuel from one tank to the other was blasted complicated. It really was. What happened one time, on a ferry flight from Richmond through to Laverton, just nicely on cruise over the Blue Mountains, for goodness sake, fair bit of height, one engine topped out. And everything seemed to be normal. There was no reason why the engine should top out at all. And it was quite worrying. We've got to get back to Richmond as quick as we can. Do we feather the air scoop, leave where it is and hope it'll pick it up? Or well, another factor I didn't just but what it amounted to is, of course, one engine chopped out for God knows what reason. There was no reason why the other one would keep going either. So it was a bit of a nail biter there for a while. Anyway, I wasn't a glider pilot in those days, but even so, we'd done a fair bit of glide approach training on Tiger models. So when I was in what I thought was glide range, cut both engines. I might make a glide approach, which I did for about 2,000 or 3,000 feet back. And I hadn't flown a Ventura much at that stage. No, they were heavy looking, clumsy. They had a remarkably good glide ratio. What the man said was, I was doing figure of S's and I went down the cage down and the flaps full down. Oh, for God's sake, get down here, Becker. Well, I didn't go through the fire fence, but I filled up, finished up about 50 metres away from it. Anyway, what the man did is left the thing where it was, the ground crew came out and read the lines, we did something, said, "She's right, mate, way you go." That was the end of that particular episode. How are we going for time? Time enough? Yes, I think, well, I wound it up at that. It's, I did have a brief encounter with those two instead of the DC-3. I'd like to talk about that one, but I think we've run enough. Foxmoth was another one. And the Liberator, well, I've already spoken about one. I think it was the Liberator. I could talk more about that one, but I think we'll leave it at that. And thank you very much for your attention.